Police officers, what is the most disturbing thing you've ever seen while on duty? I responded to a domestic disturbance one evening, just another neighbor's heard yelling call. When we arrived, the door was open, and the scene was worse than anything I could have imagined. The husband was severely injured, but he was holding their little girl who had been hiding in the closet. I'll never forget how her small body trembled with fear, even after we assured her she was safe. The father whispered. She kept quiet for hours. That kid had been listening to chaos and kept silent out of pure terror. It's one thing to hear about these stories, it's a whole different thing to live them. I got called to a fatal car crash one rainy night, and it was one of the worst I've ever worked. A young woman had lost control and hit a tree head-on. She was still holding a half-finished letter to her parents. I remember standing there in the rain, reading the ink-stained words that said, "I'm so sorry I'm putting you through this." I had to be the one to tell her parents, and watching them break down shattered me. To this day, when it rains, I think of her in that letter, wondering if there was anything that could have stopped her from driving that night. One night, we responded to a welfare check on an elderly man who hadn't been seen by neighbors in a few weeks. Inside, the smell hit us immediately, and I knew what we'd find. But it wasn't just him that broke me. It was the photos of his family, all hung up around his recliner. He had passed away alone, with no one checking in. It hit hard because at that moment I realized how easily people can be forgotten in their last days. The image of him sitting in that chair, surrounded by memories, is one I'll carry with me forever. Years back, I worked a hit-and-run case involving a cyclist who was left lying in the street. The guy had been coming back from work, just an ordinary guy, a father of two. He held my hand and asked if he was going to be okay. I tried to comfort him, but he passed a few minutes later, right there in the street. Later, his wife came down to identify him, and I had to watch her break into pieces. There's an ache that stays with you after seeing something like that, like an open wound you can't close. One time, I was dispatched to an abandoned house where neighbors had reported strange sounds. When we got there, we found a homeless family, 2 parents and a baby. They had nothing, not even shoes. The mom's feet were cracked and bleeding from walking without shoes, but she kept telling me, "It's okay, we'll make it through." I pulled every string I could to find a place for them to stay, but knowing they'd been living like that broke me. I still think of that little family, hoping they're somewhere better now. I worked a case involving a young boy who had gone missing. After a long search, we finally found him at the bottom of a ravine. It was clear he hadn't survived the fall. Breaking that news to his mother was one of the most painful things I've ever had to do. She clung to me, sobbing, her screams echoing through the forest. I had to stand there, pretending to be the strong one, while every fiber of me wanted to cry along with her. That boy's face is still burned into my memory. We responded to a house fire one night where a father and his 2 kids were trapped. When we arrived, we realized the dad had somehow managed to shield his kids from the flames, but at the cost of his own life. The kids survived, but they were in shock, clinging to the emergency blankets we wrapped around them. The youngest looked up at me and asked, "Why didn't Daddy wake up?" I don't have the words for the sorrow that filled that room, and I don't think I ever will. I once responded to a late-night call involving a teen who'd overdosed at a party. By the time we arrived, his friends were hysterical, begging us to help. We did everything we could, but it was too late. His parents arrived just as we were packing up, and seeing their faces as we broke the news was indescribable. That kind of devastation cuts deep, and I still find myself wondering if there was anything we could have done to save him. One winter night, we were dispatched to a car accident involving a young family. The mother had been ejected and didn't make it, but the father was somehow alive, holding their toddler. The man was barely coherent, repeating, why not me?" The toddler was too young to understand, just staring at eyes, his mother's scarf clutched in his hand. That scene hit me hard, especially as a parent. Sometimes the hardest part of this job is knowing you can't take away people's pain. I responded to a welfare check for an elderly woman who'd called 911, saying she needed help. When we arrived, she was sitting in a chair, clutching a small family photo album. Her breathing was shallow, and she kept whispering, "I didn't want to go alone." We stayed with her until paramedics arrived, but she passed shortly after. I'll never forget how tightly she held that album, her last connection to a family she hadn't seen in years. It's a stark reminder of how loneliness can be just as deadly as anything else. One night, we responded to a domestic dispute. When we got there, the woman was severely beaten, and her 2 small kids were huddled under the kitchen table, terrified. The older one, a little girl, looked up at me and said, "Please don't let Daddy hurt Mommy again." That level of fear, especially from a child, is something that's hard to forget. It's the kind of experience that sticks with you, no matter how many years pass. There was a night I'll never forget where we had to respond to a house where a young man had just taken his life. His sister found him, and the look in her eyes when she opened the door was one of complete and utter despair. She kept saying, "I should have seen the signs," over and over, even as we tried to comfort her. Watching someone blame themselves for something like that, knowing they'll likely never find closure, is one of the hardest parts of this job. Responded to a scene involving a young mother who had accidentally run over her toddler in the driveway. When we arrived, she was in complete shock, just sitting next to her child, unable to comprehend what had happened. Her husband arrived minutes later, and his cries echoed through the neighborhood. It's been years, but I can still hear that pain. Those are the kinds of calls that follow you home. One Christmas Eve, we responded to a call involving an older man who had died alone in his apartment. There were wrapped gifts under a small tree, all labeled with his kids' names. When I checked with dispatch, it turned out his kids hadn't visited him in years. We ended up taking the gifts to a shelter, but seeing those unwrapped presents, knowing they'd never be opened, was something that felt like a punch to the gut. Years ago, I was called to a car crash where a single father had been hit by a drunk driver. He didn't make it, and his daughter was in the back seat, calling out for him. We had to hold her back as paramedics worked on him, but she just kept screaming, "Daddy, please wake up." That night was a painful reminder of how quickly lives can change due to someone else's reckless choices. One night, we responded to a burglary in progress. When we got there, the homeowner, an elderly lady, was hiding in her closet, too scared to come out. It took us a while to coax her out, and she clung to my arm the entire time, trembling. She kept saying, "I thought I was going to die." We later found out her husband had recently passed, and she'd been living alone. The fear and vulnerability in her eyes still haunt me. I'll never forget the call about a young boy who'd accidentally hanged himself while playing. His mother found him, and by the time we arrived, she was beside herself, holding him, rocking back and forth, whispering, "My baby, my baby." We had to pry her away so the medics could take over, and that moment was one of the most heartbreaking of my career. The sight of her clutching him still gives me nightmares. One shift, we responded to a single vehicle crash on a deserted road. When we arrived, the driver was still in the car, barely conscious. He kept asking if his pregnant wife was okay, but she hadn't survived the crash. I'll never forget the moment he realized she was gone. That realization, that kind of loss, it's something that sticks with you. I still think about him sometimes, wondering how he's doing. I was on duty one night when we got a call about a possible drowning at a community pool. When we got there, a young boy had been pulled from the water, but it was too late. His parents arrived shortly after and collapsed when they saw him. The father's wailing cries were so haunting that they still play in my head sometimes. Seeing a parent lose a child is one of the hardest things about this job, and it leaves a mark. One call involved a teenager who'd been hit by a car while crossing the road at night. His friends had been with him and watched the whole thing. When we got there, they were in shock, just sitting there by his side trying to talk to him, even though he was already gone. I remember one of his friends saying, "But we were supposed to be together forever." That loss, that kind of suddenness, is something you don't forget. Years ago, I worked a call where a man had died in his car, apparently from a heart attack. When we arrived, his young son was in the backseat holding his hand, saying, "Daddy, wake up." The innocence of that moment, he didn't understand what had happened, was so incredibly painful. Even though I've seen a lot, that memory is something I still carry with me. We had a case where a mother and father were in a terrible car accident. The mother didn't survive, but the father and their young daughter did. The girl kept asking where her mom was, and the dad just broke down, unable to speak. I had to hold back tears myself. I went home that night and hugged my kids extra tight, realizing how fragile life really is. One time, I was first on the scene for a house fire. When we got there, we realized a family hadn't made it out. I can still remember the sound of their neighbors screaming in shock. Seeing a whole family gone like that, knowing they didn't stand a chance, is a kind of grief that gets burned into your mind. I once responded to a call involving a child who'd fallen from a balcony. The mother's screams when she realized what had happened were like something out of a horror movie. We couldn't do anything for him, and breaking that news to her felt like ripping out a piece of my own heart. Those kinds of moments stay with you. One Christmas Eve, we responded to a hit and run involving a little boy who'd been on his way home from a family party. His family had been waiting for him, and we had to be the ones to tell them what had happened. Seeing a mother cry out for her child, realizing he'd never make it home for Christmas, it's the kind of thing that shatters you. There was a case involving an elderly woman who'd been neglected by her caregiver. When we found her, she was barely recognizable, emaciated and scared. She looked at me and asked, "Why didn't anyone come sooner?" That kind of vulnerability and betrayal, it leaves a deep impact on you. You wonder how many others are suffering in silence. One night, we responded to a report of a shooting in a neighborhood. By the time we arrived, we found a young man lying on the sidewalk, barely alive. His mother was holding his hand, whispering to him, "You're going to be okay." He didn't make it, and the moment she realized her son was gone is something that still haunts me. We got a call about a toddler who'd been found wandering the street alone. When we located his home, it was completely trashed, and his mother was passed out. The look in that little boy's eyes was a mix of fear and confusion. I couldn't stop thinking about how someone so young had already experienced so much neglect. I once responded to a call where a young woman had been attacked in her own home. She was so bruised and scared, and as we escorted her out, she kept repeating, "I don't feel safe anywhere." The feeling of helplessness in that moment is something I can't put into words. Knowing that her trust in the world had been shattered, it's one of the hardest parts of this job.